Welcome back to Trafficking Truths. I'm Rebecca Bender, and today we're going to talk about myth number 4. But don't some girls want to be there? We are going to unpack choice. What is choice? What are the vulnerabilities that put people in a system of prostitution? And even more so, we're going to dive into the bigger issue, the corporation we should be fighting, the global sex industry that is inviting people with less choice into their establishments. Today I have on expert, founder of Exodus Cry, Benji Nolot, survivor leader and activist Melanie Thompson out of New York City, and I've also brought on founder of World Without Exploitation, Lauren Hersh. Want to welcome today. I'm so excited to bring with us Benji Nolot, founder of Exodus Cry. Benji, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, it's awesome. I really appreciate what you're doing this week with the myth busting, and just always a great time connecting with you.
Well, you are definitely a leader in the space. Exodus Cry has been a leader for a long time. Share with people who might just be just now getting involved in kind of learning about the issue of human trafficking. There's so much that's going online right now that we're seeing a lot of people peeking their ears to this topic, but they don't have a lot of insight and knowledge. Share with us a little bit more about Exodus Cry's work as a whole, what you guys are doing behind the scenes sometimes that people don't know about. I know you guys do a ton of work, and I'd love for you to share about it.
Absolutely. So I know the myth I think that we want to get to today is the myth of choice as it relates to prostitution in the sex industry. So just as kind of a placeholder for people that are watching,
Yeah.
we're excited to tackle that. A little bit of background for us, we started into this in 2007. And our journey was really one of discovery. And the first 4 years of my involvement in this field was traveling the nations, making a documentary, um, telling the story of global sex trafficking. And so I look back to that as really formative in terms of taking the time to learn about the issues at hand when we talk about something like sex trafficking, commercial sexual exploitation, child trafficking, all of that. So we listened to survivors. We listened to former traffickers and pimps and law enforcement and NGO leaders and from people around the world, and we just spent time listening, and through that began to form responses. And so I share that as a little bit of our background because it's really the message that I have for a lot of people out there today is to really get educated. A lot of people's consciousness has been awakened by the idea of save the children, the idea that there's children being trafficked in these various contexts, and there's been an awakened conscience, and I love that.
I think sometimes because your films have been so popular, people also don't know that you've done direct service for a really long time. You have an incredible manual on outreach and how churches especially can create outreach teams. I just want to make sure people know all the work you do and not just the film side.
Yeah, and just a shout out to some of our colleagues. Lila has helped spearheading the Trafficking Hub campaign right now, and she's doing an amazing job with that.
Yes.
Holding Pornhub accountable for enabling and profiting from videos of real abuse and trafficking. It's a really important campaign that we're undertaking. And then Helen Taylor, who heads up our intervention and outreach, does such an amazing job with that. And you were a big part of helping to shape that manual. And we're grateful to be a part of helping to train, equip, and mobilize people to get involved in real, outreach and touching the lives of people who are trapped in the commercial sex industry.
So good. Yeah. So everyone check out their website, see all that they do. But as this discussion and this myth around, but don't some women want to be there? We hear this a lot, and everybody gets kudos for fighting trafficking, but talk to us about the truth. Give us, you have so much. I just want to stop talking.
Yeah. No, I think it's a great myth to address, right? Because the notion of choice implies that there are some people who choose prostitution and there are some people that are forced into prostitution. There are some people that go into prostitution voluntarily, and there are some people who are taken into prostitution involuntarily. And it sort of, it creates kind of these black and white categories, and by that we then create worthy versus unworthy victim. And um, and so I think it's important to address this notion of choice, because I don't think that it's that black and white. I think that the entire premise of trying to say that some people have chosen prostitution, some people are taken into prostitution, ties back into a cover narrative that wants to sell us an idea in society, of prostitution as being this empowering, sexually liberating, human right, on and on and on. But when you look into the substance of what's there, I think the question is, how do we qualify a person's choice to enter prostitution?
Yeah.
Okay, and so to me, like, that's a really important question. Now, at the outset, this is obviously a very um, controversial subject matter. There's a lot of people who are listening to this. They've been drawn to you because you're a powerful survivor voice, and they've connected with your story, and they've read your book, or they heard you give a speech, or they've seen you on social media. And a lot of those people are maybe towards the beginning of their education on this. But all of us can agree that child sex trafficking is absolutely wrong. The Wayfair thing, um, I have mixed feelings about that because I love all the people that are sharing. What that says to me is that there are people who care. They're not apathetic. They want to make a difference. They want to expose what's going on that's wrong. They care about children.
Right.
Is Wayfair traffic this issue? It's not just save the children. Like, of course, like, save the children, but how do we prevent it? How do we put an end to it? Not just
Right.
how do we go out and rescue somebody, but how do we actually bring an end to it? And that's where this issue of choice becomes really important. So can I just take a minute to kind of break that down, or do you want to
Please.
jump in?
No, I'm loving. We're here for your voice. People hear me all day long on my. We're here for you.
Okay, so what we have to do is we have to qualify. Okay, how do we qualify a person's choice to enter prostitution? And there are so many factors that contribute towards somebody making a so-called choice, right? We know that there's issues of child sexual abuse and how that would disrupt somebody. We know there's issues of mental health disorders, like someone that grows up with a parent that has a mental health disorder and the effect that has on them. We know there's issues of marginalization, racial discrimination. There's I could go on and on. I one time wrote out a list of just 20 things that affect predominantly females in our society, but of the things that make a person vulnerable. And when you look at all these underlying factors that contribute towards a person's choice, we see that the very idea of a choice is imbued with so many shades of gray. And I'll give you one example of that. Okay. So there was this young girl, she was 14 years old. She met who she believed was going to be the love of her life, and he was going to help her have a successful modeling career. She was living in Atlantic City, grew up in, for all intents and purposes, a good home, but by her own admission was raised on MTV. And she, at 14 years old, ran away to go be with this man of her dreams. The first night she meets up with him at the hotel, he has her get up into this, short mini skirt and all this, and he's like, "Hey, actually, I'm not, gonna, put you into modeling. You're gonna go into prostitution." He puts her out on the streets of Atlantic City, 14 years old. She's there on this, being sold at 14, first night on Atlantic City. And she's describing to me this whole experience. And I say to her, because I couldn't imagine it. I couldn't imagine being put at 14 years old on the street for like some random dude to come by. Like, I'm like, what? Like, I could not wrap my mind around it.
Right.
And so I say to her, I'm like, wow, I was like, what was that like? Like, at that young age to be put out there and you thought this guy was your dreams and now you're being sold and she goes, I felt empowered. I was like, what? She goes, yeah, no, I felt empowered. I was like, what meaneth thou this? I was like, what do you mean? What are you talking about? She goes, well, she said, I felt empowered because I thought if people wanted to buy me, I had value. She goes, and I go, wow, that is so interesting. She goes, no, yeah, I was groomed by my culture way before I was groomed by my trafficker.
Wow. So
What
good.
so let me just give you an example of that. Rihanna has a song called Pour It Up. The lyrics of the song are, it's all about dollar bills and stripper poles. The
Right.
image is of her writhing around on a stripper pole and throwing dollar bills everywhere, right? You're a 13, you're a 11, 12, 13-year-old girl. You see this cultural icon, you internalize that into the construction of your own view of yourself as a woman in the world and what it means to be an empowered woman. I mean, what is that message sending, right? It's so these cultural grooming realities are sending young women cascading into the sex industry. So how do we qualify the choice
Yeah.
of that person?
So good.
Right?
You know who talks about the influence of culture? Almost like I think she even says it in terms of like the peer pressure of the culture is Centoya Brown. She has a lot of her interviews about the pressure of culture. And even I talk about a little, I think I didn't even unpack it enough because you only have so many words that you're allowed in the book, right? So many word count, but sharing how, I was raised listening to a very, very graphic kind of music. And my mom would just sing along with it on our way driving to school. I literally can remember us getting in the car, putting on like NWA and her just singing along with it. Boys in the Hood are always hard. Like we just,
wow.
and so the amount as a young person, like you're saying, 13, 14, of just like, and I'm not saying that, but like music is influential, culture as a whole. We're not just pinpointing one specific artist or one specific thing, but I think it's fascinating that we're not putting more thought into the influence of culture when we're talking.
Culture that in many ways views women as the property of men. And so a lot of women even grow up in an extreme version of that, like more of the pimp culture reality where it's what is expected. Some people will become pimps and some people will become hoes. And that's in some contexts figurative or metaphorical, in others it's literal. And but that's still, a part of kind of the sociological underpinnings of our world today. And so I want to just connect some dots with this because some people may be saying, okay, well, where are you going and how does this apply to choice? When we talk about swimming upstream, we talk about turning off the shutting down the raw sewage that's coming into our world, like uprooting this, trafficking, at the root. How do we do that? We have to do that by addressing demand.
Yes.
The entire global commercial sex industry, all of sex trafficking would end today, and we would see the largest exodus of human beings from systematic oppression that the world has ever seen if men stop buying women and children for sex. Well, the problem is that as long as we have some people who are choosing prostitution and others who are and others who are being forced into prostitution, as long as we have that dichotomy as the way we understand the sex industry, then we can't go at the root. Okay, I've been told this by anti-trafficking organizations. Okay, you can't address demand. Why? Because that would be politically incorrect. Why? Because that would be to invoke the wrath of the quote unquote pro-sex work movement. that exists on the basis of demand. So the idea of quote unquote sex work and people who are voluntarily choosing prostitution is that we want to expand the sex industry. We want to build demand. We want to create a client base,
Mm.
right? And so you can't, so it puts these things in conflict. Well, the issue is, so that's part of it. We can't actually get to the root of this issue as long as we have this dichotomy. The second thing is it true? Is this dichotomy true? And my answer to that, having studied this now for 13 years, is that's an absolutely false narrative. The reality is not that women choose prostitution. The reality is that prostitution chooses women. When you look at the underlying factors in our culture that are sending women into prostitution, we cannot qualify. When you look at the poverty, when you look at child sexual abuse, when you look at cultural conditioning, when you look at all the underlying factors, what we're talking about is vulnerability. The commercial sex industry is a predatory industry, and it seeks for and searches out the most vulnerable demographics of people in our world, and it pulls them like a vortex into prostitution. And
Yes.
so the way we understand human trafficking is as the exploitation of vulnerability. So we, a long time ago, stopped using the terminology of those who've chosen it versus those who have been forced into it. We stopped trying to define in and out worthy versus unworthy victim. And we view people's entry into prostitution, because when we talk about choice, what we're talking about is how does somebody get into the position of being sold for sex as a routine of their life? How
Right.
does that, yeah, how does that happen? And so we stopped trying to, do all these, define in and out all these different things, and we started to, this is the main other ingredient that has to be considered when we talk about connecting dots. How do we understand the system of prostitution? Now, when I just want to say a couple things about that. It's really important for people to dig into resources on this. The systems level analysis of prostitution is the single most important thing that anybody out there can do right now who has had their consciousness awakened. Okay. The most important thing that you can do is not go hire a bunch of commandos. It's not, all the things that I'm seeing spread across social media. The most important thing that you can do is go get a deeply informed, educated understanding of a systems level analysis of prostitution. I'm going to spit out some resources.
Yes.
Get The Pimping of Prostitution by Julie Bindel. Get Paid For by Rachel Morin. Go to Prostitution Research and Education. Read all of Melissa Farley's research and many others. Get Being and Being Bought by Kaisa Ekis Ekman. Of course, read Rebecca's book. Listen to the voice of survivors. Begin to develop an understanding of the decades-old radical feminist critique of prostitution. Look at the research that has been done in Sweden that was done for 30 years, and begin to go and search out those resources. I think that is so important, because here's the thing. Again, we all care about children who are being trafficked, okay? They are a part of a larger system. The larger system that we should be looking at is not Wayfair. I'm sorry, it's not Wayfair. Like, it's not. The larger system we should be looking at is the global commercial sex industry. It's all the places where people are being sold for sex. It's the massage parlor that's open down the street from you at 12 o'clock at night, and you never thought to yourself, is that a little strange? It's the
Right.
it's the high class escort agency. It's the biggest agent in porn, the mainstream Los Angeles-based porn industry. The biggest agent was recently indicted for trafficking because he was operating a whole escort thing on the side and coercing the women in pornography. So you look at escorting, porn, stripping, all the forms of prostitution, the massage parlors, This is where these people are being sold. We need to look to that. And when we look to that, what we need to understand is that no, this isn't about the person who chose it and the person who didn't. We just need to be PC about not addressing demand, because after all, a man should be able to request the services of all that baloney is not. We need a deeper level analysis. The reality is that decades of international research and the voice of survivors for decades have shown us empirically, have shown us and told us
Yeah.
the system of prostitution is inherently harmful. It doesn't matter if the person identifies as a sex worker. I mean, who's that in the best interest of? That is in the best interest of pimps and brothel owners.
And buyers.
This idea, and buyers. This idea, I mean, pimps love it. They love that. Traffickers love it. They love it when people go around spreading this terminology about sex work. They love it because they know that it obscures the inherent harm of prostitution. Prostitution is inherently harmful. And because, so let me just give this last bit on this, because
Yep.
I think it's this piece is such an important part of these dots that I'm trying to connect.
Yes.
So higher basis of prostitution is based on the inequality of desire. You have on one person who is looking for a sexual encounter, and you have on the other hand a person who does not want that sexual encounter, and by virtue of that, payment takes place. That is called a coerced consent. In this case, it's the money that's coercing the consent. Well, what do we believe about consent? What is authentic consent? Can consent be coerced? No, it can't. So the entire basis of prostitution happens on the inequality of desire. Now, I'm saying this cuts across everybody. This cuts across from the child that is being trafficked to the person who is quote unquote identifying, the person who identifies as a quote unquote sex worker at 30 years old. It cuts across the spectrum. They all experience it as a violation of their humanity. Why? Because they do not desire the sexual encounter that is happening. And so if you have two people who come into a room, the man and the woman, he puts the money on the table and says, you can take the money and leave, or you can stay for the sex. What's she going to do? What's she going to do 10 times out of 10? Again, whether it's the child, whether it's take the money and leave, because she doesn't want the sex. She doesn't desire him in her heart. She doesn't desire the man after him. She doesn't desire the strange fantasy that the next guy after him, after him, after him, after him. I mean,
and matter of fact, we actually have terms that we would say in the game to try to get out of doing that. Like, we'll just trick roll him. We'll just trick F him. Just do, like, you have these terms to purposefully trick them to not do it and take the money. We would have a drag that we would run on, a trick where we would say, like, we'll just tell him you forgot condoms, and then after he pays you, literally. And you know how many times someone would pay me, I'd be like, oh, I forgot condoms, I'm gonna run down to the gift shop real quick of this hotel, and 5 out of 10 times they would say okay. The other 5 would be like, give me my money back till you get back. And so some of them would, but you would try continually to not do it, actually. So it like even furthers what you're saying with lived experience stories of, it's like, what would they do? Not only what would they have offered, we're actively trying not to.
Well, if we continue to allow demand to flourish around the world, if we continue to sell our society this idea that sex work is work, if we continue to sell our society this idea that it's perfectly normal for men to buy sex, no, if we actually want to bring an end to this larger system of exploitation, we have to address the demand that's fueling it. So I think that the idea of choice, the way that it's promoted and presented by the pro-sex work movement, is actually a way to deceive and delude people into a false narrative of prostitution that we then dissociate ourselves from, and then we turn our attention to Wayfair, right? We're like, well, I'll go after it over here. And it's like, no, we all need to work together to understand the deeper underlying issues and work together to cut off the source of this pollution that's flooding the ocean, as opposed to just going and trying to rescue dolphins and turtles. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, but I think so many dots, cultural, and you know what, sometimes it becomes easier, I think, for people to say, just get back on your tablets and turn on Alexa. I'm going to go post about Save the Children. And it's like, that's fine. And I get the heart in it, but we need to move much more upstream, put filters on your kid's phone, listen to what they're listening to, have conversations with them about agency and choice and healthy sexuality and protecting and defending and looking at vulnerable people. And how are you getting involved in the local task force efforts in your community to help at homeless youth programs, to assist marginalized people in your neighborhood? Like, that seems a lot more work. And I wonder, at a time when we're not able to really leave our houses and do stuff, I'm wondering if that's why it's fueling online at levels like never before. But we have to be much more thoughtful around this upstream issue of demand and the global sex industry that's fueling the demand, where the victims become younger and younger, and the pornified culture. You could talk for hours. You have a school, I'm sure, coming out, and you've got, like, there's so much info you have. I know we're barely touching the surface. On next week's or tomorrow's Myth, we are actually doing the Myth on Demand. We're bringing in Tom Perez to talk about masculinity and healthy masculinity. We're bringing on survivor leader Marian Hatcher from Space International that talks about and that just talks about her work working in John schools and with the local sheriff office. There's all of these myths build on each other. We hope you guys tune in for all of them. And please go do the research that Benji just talked about. Are some of these resources on your website, Benji, if people want a link out to all of the things?
Yeah.
Share what that URL is for us.
Yeah, www.exoduscry.com. Great.
Go to exoduscry.com, click on the resource page, learn about these systemic analysis of prostitution. You articulate this so well. I'm like, yeah, do what he says. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Rebecca. I really appreciate you and everything you're doing. We'll talk again soon.
All right, welcome. Today, I am so excited, you guys, to bring with us activist and survivor leader Melanie Thompson. Melanie, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us a little bit, if you don't mind starting. I've been having everyone kind of share about the work that you do. You've been in this field for a little while now. You do youth outreach. You work with a lot of people, and you have a lot of experience that I would love for you to share with our listeners.
Sure, absolutely. So my name is Melanie Thompson, and I am currently a full-time college student. However, I simultaneously am an advocate in the anti-human trafficking and anti-prostitution sector. And I've been an advocate for 10 years now. So I started really young, 14 to be exact.
Wow.
And to be honest, it really just started with a really small interview that somebody did of me when I was held in juvenile detention. And when I saw what that article looked like, even though it was a super small section of a newspaper, I realized at that point that my voice was very valuable and that it could reach a lot of people who have been exploited the way I have. So from that point on, it just started as like a passion thing for me, and then it turned into, this is an issue that affects so many people and so many people need to hear about it. So I've just been doing this work from the heart, really.
I love it. Share with us, you talked about your lived experience and through the criminal juvenile justice system, which needs a lot of reform, we all know. But one of the questions that I have heard you articulate so well, I'm like, I need to take out a notebook. Y'all ain't got a pen and paper. Take one out, get ready, because the stuff that you share, and you're so young, like the next generation is going to take this movement by storm. If this is the incredible insight that's coming in, you talk about what is really choice, in a way that I'm always blown away whenever I hear you talk about this. Would you talk to us about this myth that I know you hear, I've heard, that it's like, well, don't some women want to be there? Aren't there some women that choose to be in this? Break that down for us a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So I always say that you can't make a choice if you don't have choices. And oftentimes, many people that are in the sex trade and that end up being exploited are coming from a lack of resources. So when you're coming from marginalization and you're coming from being impoverished, or living in an impoverished community, a lot of people tend to go for the only thing that is welcoming them with open arms, and prostitution always targets the most vulnerable. It targets the same individuals that have no resources, and then provides itself by saying, hey, here you are, I'm here to help you because I know you don't have anything. And that's what prostitution does, is the system of prostitution. That is what it does. And they target us. So many people on the surface, they think that the person that's in prostitution or in the sex trade is making a choice because there's no pimp, or there's no gun to their head, and people can't seem to fathom below that surface level. But if you actually dig a little deeper, prostitution, the sex trade, whatever have you, a lot of the people that make the choice to engage are usually doing so because it's their only option. So it's not a true autonomous and a true autonomous choice that's backed by agency. It just can't be.
When people think of this glamorous life of empowered sex workers, do you remember? I know I remember being in the game. We call it the game, right? I'm West Coast, so we called it the game. I know the East Coasters are like the life, but I can remember never thinking that I was a victim of human trafficking. I remember it being in it, thinking of myself as an empowered, I didn't use the term sex worker back there, but I felt this false sense of empowerment that I felt like I had control over and I was going to get to, and it's just this false narrative that we believe. And I'd love to hear from you about kind of that life cycle of agency, so to speak, of like when you're in the middle of the exploitation, why is it that we see it as empowerment until we're removed from it? And then we recognize the objectification, the oppression, all the things that you just talked about. Why is that? Why do people in it think it's empowering? Are we brainwashed? Like, what's the deal?
Well, okay, so I'll first start by saying that I would never negate or minimize the narrative of somebody else. If they say that this is something that they chose to do, I recognize that there are a slim 2% of the population in prostitution that truly made that choice. But what I and I can agree with you when I said that, I knew that I was going through something. I didn't realize that I was a victim of anything, right? And what I find is that in order for us as people to continue to go through prostitution day in and day out, you have to tell yourself that you're in control of that situation for your psychological development, because nobody can continuously engage in paid rape over and over without feeling like they have control on that situation. So oftentimes, I know for me specifically, I had to tell myself that I was the person that was making that choice in order for me to get through the day and say, I'm the one that's in charge of this, although the oppression is on me and I'm the one being exploited and it's my body that's being paid for. And what a lot of people don't understand, when they have this false narrative of sex work, I always say sex work is neither. Sex is not work and work is not sex, nor was it ever intended to be used for those purposes. But you can't call prostitution empowering when you're not the person that's in the center of its development. And I always love to quote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights definition of what decent work is. It talks about being in the center of development. It talks about having gainful employment, right? You can't move up on the food chain in prostitution. You don't get promoted. And a lot of people, I personally I feel a lot of people try to adopt the term sex work because it's honestly, it sanitizes and it sugarcoats and it masks the inherent harms of prostitution. And sometimes a lot of people want to separate trafficking, prostitution, choice, because again, in society, it's easier to grasp onto the happier narrative. You don't want to hear about the violent harms. You don't want to hear that you as a person in society are turning a blind eye to them. And a lot of times, the people that are the perpetrators are people that have either positions of authority, names in society. So we try to switch the narrative, right, to mask that misogyny by saying this is the empowered choice of the woman or the person that's in prostitution, as opposed to shifting the focus on who's the one that's perpetuating the system, which 9 times out of 10 are these men with positions of power and disposable income. So to do that, to make it seem like this is a choice, you take the word prostitution out because that's stigmatizing and it has a negative connotation when you hear about it. You change the word to sex work and then back up that sex work term with these happy narratives of people who haven't been exploited, of that the people, you back them up with the 2% of people in prostitution who had who had choices and had that privilege, and you have them speak for the rest of the 98% of people who didn't have choices and this was their only option. And when you do that, now you take over the narrative and people are like, well, she chose this. She chose this because, again, nobody goes beyond that surface level thinking. They see
Right.
no gun to their head. They see no pimp. They automatically assume this was something that they just decided to do one day, instead of actually recognizing where they come from and why prostitution was a viable option for them.
Explain to us more of the on-ramp onto who is at risk, what makes people vulnerable to exploitation. Do we all need to be afraid that our kids are wearing masks right now and they're all going to be kidnapped out of IKEA today? Like, what
right.
is the what do we need to be watchful of as a community? Who do we need to be watchful for? How can we do better to look for people that are highly at risk and step in? What does that look like? Who is that? What do we do?
So I feel like this is the question of the century that we are all trying to
No
answer,
pressure.
properly.
Answer
Right.
answer the
pressure.
world's problem. No pressure. Go ahead.
But I can say that the game, the life, prostitution, the sex trade, whatever we call it, it can target anybody. However, because the system of prostitution targets the most vulnerable, you have to focus on the people that are in the most vulnerable populations. So we know that overwhelmingly the prostitution affects or disproportionately Black and brown girls and well over 40% of trans identifying individuals. We know that statistic or whatever is the way it is because of racial inequities definitely play a huge role in who's targeted. Because Black and brown folks are marginalized and at a standard where our communities get targeted first, and because in the LGBT plus community, because they're so disproportionately affected by racism and being homeless and being somebody that's ran in with the law at some point, they're also extremely marginalized and extremely targeted as well. So we know that those are the main populations. That does not exclude the fact that it can hit a white woman with a whole bunch of privilege. It doesn't exclude the fact that it can hit anybody from any country, race, color, or creed. Just to leave people on this note, to me, listening to this podcast is the first step. Secondly, question everything that you hear. Like if you read something in a paper that says sex work is work and that's it, don't run with that and think that that represents every survivor in the world. I encourage people to do their research and learn more about the vulnerabilities that got all of those people into this in the first place. Because nobody wakes up one day and says, I just want to be a prostitute. That's not how majority of us in the life were like. So do your research and question things first.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, thank you so much, activist Melanie Thompson. I cannot wait to continue to watch you on your journey. Okay, awesome. So I want to welcome today Lauren Hersh from World Without Exploitation and the Equality Model. Lauren, welcome.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. It's so great to be with you. It's great to see you. I'm so looking forward to having this conversation with you.
So I want to ask a couple questions. Obviously, this is our Mythbuster campaign, and we have a lot of myths throughout this that we want to share, but one specifically I was hoping you could talk to, because you're doing a ton of work in this space, and obviously you've seen a lot even pre-World We, is this myth that some women want to be there. We hear this all the time, well, don't some women want to be there? Don't some people want to be involved in prostitution? Aren't there some women that are choosing sex work, quote unquote, air quotes for those that can't see? And I'd love for you to speak into this thought of agency and choice around empowerment, because I know that I believe one way. We might have listeners that are a little bit on the fence. We might have listeners that are completely disagreeing. We all know that we're not all going to agree on everything within fields. What I think we all can agree on is that nobody wants people hurt. And so we're going to give you our side. Mine and Lauren we align on this, and take it for what it is. If you decide, I'm still on the fence, I'm going to go do research, that's fine. Today, we're just giving you our perspective on why do some women want to be there.
So before I unpack this idea of choice, I want to be really clear that through my opinion, I always think it's important to kind of know where a person comes from and how they got to the place that they got to. And so at World Without Exploitation, and even well before, so much of the way I believe about this issue really comes from putting my ear to the ground and working with hundreds of survivors, you know, at one point just in New York and now all over the country.
Right.
And so that's really like, I think that's sort of ground zero. I think that if we are going to talk about choice, or we're going to talk about any of these myths, I think it's critically important to make sure that we're listening to the voices of survivors. And here's what I'm hearing.
Right.
Time and time and time again. What I hear is that this is not about choice. Prostitution is not about choice. It is very much about lack of choices, lack of options. So maybe there's one or two or a very small minority who may say that they're choosing. Okay, they're the very small minority. But the vast majority of the survivors that I work with or I speak with say that they landed in prostitution because of issues of inequality, gender, racial, income inequality. So it can't be choice when there's no choice involved, when a person can't get Pampers, can't afford to put Pampers on their children, or can't, they don't know where they're getting their next meal. So Rebecca, I had a number of situations while I was a prosecutor where I would pull a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old out of prostitution and she would say, oh, but I'm doing this voluntarily. Okay. She's 15.
Right.
She's 16, right? There's a lot at play there. And then when you begin to even peel back the layers even more, she will, once you have earned her trust, right? That piece is so important. She will tell you that she, you know, was approached by a guy on the street or online or whatever who promised to love her, care for her, get her, you know, I heard a number of times, a McDonald's meal. And she didn't know where she was going to get her next meal. That's not choice.
Right. Well, and I want to make sure that people that are listening understand when we're talking about too, people who are not identifying as having a trafficker, a third party involved, if they are feeling as if entering into the sex industry is their only option due to lack of options. You know, because I want to specify, talk us through some of that. I know we call it the hand model internally, where we're like human trafficking, buying, selling, da, 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 da. Maybe walk people through that too, so that we can see, you know, human trafficking. Well, first of all, anyone under the age of 18, if they're involved in commercial exploitation in any form, is considered a victim of trafficking due to age. Although in some states, if there's not that third party and a commercial element exchange, it's not considered a trafficking charge, but a pandering charge or a promoting prostitution charge. It all varies. I know it's all a little nuanced depending on the very details of each specific case. But walk us through prostitution without a trafficker. Walk us through that equality model. Like, what does that law look like? Tell us about the policy around that.
Okay, so the equality model, I think that there are a lot of people out there that think maybe it's confusing or complicated. It is super simple. So what the equality model actually is a piece of legislation or multiple pieces of legislation that will ultimately decriminalize people in prostitution, right? So no criminal penalties for people in prostitution, recognizing just what you said, Rebecca, that the vast majority of people in prostitution are not there by choice. They're there because of lack of choices, right? So decriminalizing people in prostitution, making sure, and this piece is really important, that they're getting exit strategies and services, because we know that when people leave the sex trade, they need a whole host of services. So those two prongs, decriminalizing people in prostitution, making sure that they're getting exit strategies and services. At the same time, the third prong is to hold accountable those who exploit, the buyers, the pimps, the brothel owners. And that has to happen. We need to make sure we're holding accountable those who exploit, because they're causing devastating long-term harm to all people in prostitution.
Yeah.
And then the fourth piece, and this part is critically important, and it's an education piece, because the reality is that we need to get in, and great, we're having this conversation. Presumably many of your listeners are adults. It's important for adults to have this conversation, but we also need to make sure that we're educating young people, because when we get in there and we educate young people, especially young boys, about the fact that buying sex is not a rite of passage. There's something fundamentally flawed when you actually look at the research
of the issue of sex for sale. I think it's very it's infrequent that people take a minute to think through. And I would encourage, if you're going to be listening to this on a podcast, if you're watching this on IGTV and you're done with this, maybe set your phone down for a minute and think through what I heard Vinita Carter refer to as systemic prostitution. A lack of options, a lack of social services, a lack of, increased in addiction, increased in drugs. And like, there's just so many layers than complexities. I don't know that people really have ever sat and like thought about unpacking how this system even got into place.
Yes. And there's another piece to this, which is that we're watching this. I think it's like completely horrific, but I don't know whether it's society or the media or whatever it is, but there's this big push to sort of ram down the throats of young people that this is empowering. You're supposed to, if you are progressive, or you are, if you are a feminist, you should believe that prostitution is empowering. But if you actually speak to survivors, and you speak to this in a much more eloquent way than I do, there's nothing empowering about being in a situation where somebody's body is being bought and sold 10 times a day. There's just nothing empowering. And actually, Rebecca, when we sort of think about choice, what I've heard so many times from so many survivors that I've worked with is that while they were in the sex trade, they had to believe that it was their choice. That was sort of the lie that they told themselves again and again and again, because that's how they got through from one minute to the next, was actually believing that they had some sort of choice at the heart of it. But once there was therapy, and once there was time and space and healing,
right,
and there was a deep recognition that actually there was no choice involved.
So true. And so it's almost like these two cultural pressures, for lack of better words. One where we're talking about society in general, really trying to tell younger women are all varying on the spectrum of, well, but what about sex workers? We want to empower women that want to be there, and it's their body and their autonomy, and we're helping women of color, and we're helping all these marginalized people. And I'm always like, what? But I really want to help you unpack that a little bit, that we're giving men access to marginalized people. How is that empowering for them? What's the get out plan? What's the retirement plan? How do you navigate sexual harassment charges in an industry that is sexual harassment? Like, I just don't know that it's as empowering as we're culturally telling young people.
And like, what's that about, really? Right? It's almost like our young people are being sold this bag of goods in order to normalize and legitimize the sex trade so that men can continue to buy women. And girls. So there's something really like messed up about that. Really messed up. And so it's like, I don't know. It seems like so deceptive.
It's also, the other thing that I find interesting that you just talked about was the having to tell yourself to get through, and whether you're there by choice or force. Choice, obviously, again, air quotes, choice, meaning no trafficker. But I can remember feeling this false narrative that I was empowered to be in prostitution with my trafficker. And you you may have read this in my book, small shameless plug for my book, by the way, In Pursuit of Love, available anywhere books are sold. But I share this story where I can remember driving with him, and it was Halloween, and everybody wants to go to Vegas and dress up as Tina Fey mockingly calls it modern feminism when she mocks like sexy corn as a Halloween costume. Like everything sexy now is a costume. And I don't know if you've seen her joke on it. And she's like, and this is modern feminism. She's being sarcastic. And so I'm seeing these women, these young women come to Vegas. They're dressed, it's their one time of the year. They have permission to dress as little clothing as possible, it seems. And I can remember driving down and seeing these girls in like literally like teddies, not lingerie, negligee from the 90s teddies with garter belts, feather boas, and they're walking downtown Vegas, like literally in this attire. And my trafficker leaned over and he pointed at them and he goes, do you see those girls? They wish they could be you. You're brave enough to be it every day. And this weird thing in me was like, you're right. They want to be me. They're dressing up as me. And it's like, it's so twisted in the way that you fall for and just like eat up this narrative that somehow it's empowering. It's like you want to know that because it justifies and allows you to push aside. What I love about this topic is the amount of people that are all on board regardless. Like this is an issue to stop the hypersexuality and the increase in sex for sale in our culture. There's a push from both political parties, from all different types of faith communities. Like people from all over are starting to see this isn't working well for us in society. And I love that it's a place that so many people can come together to find a common ground to try to change. What are some steps? I mean, I have so many more questions, but what are some steps that people can do to get involved in fighting hypersexuality as a whole, to fighting this issue? I mean, they're concerned about their kids, but I'm hoping that after this interview, they'll see there's this much broader, there's this macro level view too of like, but why is this even happening? Like, why do we have sex for sale at like never before? How can they get involved?
I think over the next bunch of months, you're going to see some laws coming up. You're going to see a push in certain places for full decriminalization of the sex trade. And I would say, number 2, don't be fooled. What full decriminalization actually is a push to fully decriminalize the sex trade in its entirety, which means decriminalizing pimps, sex buyers, and brothel owners. And no, if you actually looked at the legislation, those are not the words that you'd see. You might see decriminalizing third parties, pimps, right?
Right.
So be really careful about this legislation, but also recognize what these full decriminalization bills really are. And I think that there's some serious advocacy that needs to happen. So you can check out our equalitymodelus.org website, and that will keep people updated on different laws that are happening. So that's the responsive piece, responding to these full decriminalization bills and making sure that your lawmakers understand that full decriminalization is deeply problematic. And at the same time, and I guess this would be number 3, pushing for the equality model.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Do you have anything else you want to add on Mythbusters that you want people to know about?
Worldwithoutexploitation.org, equalitymodelus.org.
So good. Thank you so much for joining me.
And bye.
You guys, that's a wrap. I want to thank our sponsor, #RealityCheckIt, for bringing all of this information to you today. Please make sure you check out our YouTube page where all of these guests have their entire full-length interview. And if you like what you're hearing and you like what you're seeing, please share it on social media, tag a friend. We want to get this information out to everybody that's interested in this topic. And stay tuned for an upcoming podcast where we explore all of this into anywhere where you watch your favorite shows. Thanks again.
Have you ever wondered what it's like to start over with nothing?
Human trafficking. It's the largest social justice issue of our time.
What happens to women and children after they escape, after they complete a program?
How do you start life over again with a renewed sense of purpose?
Elevate Academy was birthed from that.
Elevate is an online school that offers courses, mentors, small groups, in-person chapters, homework activities, and job opportunities.
So that survivors of human trafficking can start to actually dream again and then create steps to get there.
By partnering with us financially every month for 1 year, you not only change the course of a survivor's life, but also her children and her children's children.
But it doesn't stop there.